Semantic question. Is a secret technically a secret if the answer was in plain sight all along? For example, pre-time skip there was a lot of speculation about Sanji's hidden eyebrow, but there really shouldn't have been because it was flat out revealed to us in chapter 173 when we see both eyebrows on his Dendenmushi. Was Franky joining the crew during Water 7 supposed to be a secret? Because long before we landed on Water 7, Luffy drew a picture of the next crew member and it's just flat out Franky. And was it a massive plot twist when Blackbeard took Whitebeard's devil fruit? Not really, considering that during Impel Down, Blackbeard stated that his plan was to shake the world. That one might be more clever wordplay by Oda there, and quite frankly, our mistake for not taking it as literally as we should have. But speaking of Blackbeard, here's something that almost no one notices. In chapter 134, Luffy says that he once heard from a guy in a bar that there are people in this world who don't sleep. And if that sounds familiar, it's because in chapter 966, a rumor is spread by a certain clown that Blackbeard never sleeps. Very serendipitous considering that Luffy said this during Drum Island, which was also the arc with our first mention of Blackbeard. I'm gonna be real with you. These are not secrets. They're more like cool pieces of foreshadowing. It's just Eiichiro Oda doing a bit of Sunday story gardening, planting narrative seeds that grow into strong, healthy conclusions. What I'm more interested in are the times when Oda brazenly blew his narrative load and no one noticed. Because the sheer audacity that this man has is unrivaled. For example, here's Sabo say hello to Sabo. You may remember him from such arcs as The Reverie, Dressrosa, and Luffy's post-war flashback, with Sabo's first official appearance in the series being chapter 583, Grey Terminal. And to many it was shocking that Luffy suddenly had a second brother, bringing the brother count to a grand total of 3. But for those who had been paying attention, this was a character that we'd been waiting to see for quite some time. In chapter 558, there's a short flashback of Ace and Luffy featuring a panel with 2 Sakazuki cups, which is of course redundant to say. Sakazuki means sake cups. So what you're saying with Sakazuki cups is sake cups. But even more wrong than the redundancy is the number. Because, and this is admittedly a lot more obvious in the colored version, but you can see the tip of a 3rd Sakazuki sake cup. And the One Piece fanbase is so insane that we picked up on this immediately. And this was Oda obviously confirming that there was a 3rd brother. But even then, this was not new information. Because in chapter 157, Ace arrives, the titular Ace takes a face snap in some local Alabastan cuisine, and we first see his iconic tattoo with the word Ace misspelt. And it was later revealed in One Piece Green Secret Pieces that the S is a tribute to Sabo, because that was his Jolly Roger, a big S with an even bigger cross. He could not have made Sabo more obvious, well, short of revealing Sabo's entire design during, say, East Blue, which he did in chapter 98, Dark Clouds. We have a tiny part of a tiny panel, but in the crowd you can see a figure with Sabo's exact design. A very prominent eye-grabbing figure as well, with a dark design in the center amongst a crowd of predominantly light figures, almost as if they purposely exist to frame his prominence. Oh, and he's also the only one wearing a hat, and considering we're outdoors, I would have expected more hats. But Sabo being in Logtown makes sense because Dragon was there, so other Revolutionary Army members could be there as well. But this is probably just a coincidence, yeah? A random design amongst tens of characters that feels maybe sort of similar. I mean, it's not like we see it again, right? Well, I'm afraid it is very much like that. This character appears again in chapter 99, but this time right below Luffy looking up. So he's made his way to the front of the crowd, which is a little thing we like to call character development. This mysterious top-hatted man noticed a clown about to murder a child and took great interest in the affair. And if Dragon hadn't intervened, you'd have to wonder if Sabo would have. Or if he would have just stood there and watched Luffy die, thus triggering the reversal of his amnesia. But if you're still not convinced, look, I have more things. When you look at the digitally colored release, in both instances, the character matches Sabo's color scheme, although it is a bit inconsistent between 98 and 99. These digitally colored chapters first started being released in 2012, which is important because that was 2 years after Sabo's introduction in Luffy's flashback. So they may have intentionally given him this scheme knowing that it was Sabo. Although that is a huge assumption because Sabo himself did not reappear until 2013. But in a mind-blowing, brain-bending narrative sackwhack, it turns out that Oda not only introduced Sabo in chapter 98, but when you think about it, Sabo appeared before Ace did. But who remembers when the sun god Nika first appeared? Many would say that it was in chapter 1018, when, in between bouts of racist rhetoric towards Jinbei, Usu first brought up the apparently even more taboo topic topic of the sun god. Chapter 1018 was pretty old news though. I mean, it was newer news, but the news itself wasn't actually news. So it's more like olds, new olds. Because in chapter 300 during the Skypiea party, there is a key panel where Luffy is drawn in the sun god silhouette. And now that we have the images, that comparison is quite well known. But what a lot of people tend to forget is that the sun god was quite literally first mentioned in Skypiea as well. In chapter 287, we learn that the Shandians actually worship the sun god in addition to a series of others, being the rain, forest, and earth gods, which gives particular resonance to the panel in chapter 300 because we're seeing Luffy through Wiper's eyes, and what we're seeing is his sun god. So it's a very strong moment of religious catharsis for good old Wiper, even if his tribe didn't quite live up to the idea of the sun god, considering that they made human sacrifices in his honor, which is a very he did not laugh kind of action. Something that made me laugh though was realizing that Oda revealed the future 4 emperors way back in Jaya. And here they are. On the cover of volume 25, you can see our current set of 4 emperors and a goat, and also a miner in the background next to Shanks. But mostly we're focused on the emperors. A cover which was redone for volume 105, with each of our characters reprising their positions, having achieved emperorhood. Although we did replace the goat with a rabbit. And you know something fun in retrospect? All 4 of the current emperors were present at Marineford. And it makes me so proud to see these 2 covers side by side, knowing how far they've all come, even Blackbeard. I find it very hard to root against him, because back here, he's just another unknown like Luffy. And it's really hard for me not to appreciate the underdog story, even again when it's Blackbeard. Meanwhile, in chapter 801, Sanji was given a very curious bounty that stated only alive, thus implying that Sanji is someone important, or at the very least being mistaken for someone important. And it turns out that it was the former, as he was a prince of the Germa Kingdom. Big plot twist there, ooh. But also not very woo, because it was given away well in advance. In chapter 222, Sanji says that he was born in North Blue. But this is curious because Luffy, Zoro, Nami, and Usopp were all East Blue natives. And it's clear that Sanji spent some time in North Blue beyond being a baby, because he recognized the Lion Nolan tale. But North Blue is known for one fairly common feature, and that is vast quantities of wealth. North Blue is the home of the ultra wealthy, or at least as wealthy as one can be if you're not a world noble. Bellamy, for example, is also from North Blue, and he left his life of luxury because he was bored. Trafalgar Law was also born in North Blue, in the wildly rich white city of Flavance, where everyone either grows up to be a doctor, or these days doesn't grow up at all, either due to amber lead poisoning or the world government purge. So no matter what, Sanji came from some money. The question was, how much? And the answer was quite a lot, which was hinted at even earlier in chapter 220, when Zoro, Sanji, and Luffy dive down to the wreckage of the ship that fell from Skypiea. Here, Sanji finds an old photo of a fairly well-off looking woman, and he lingers on it dramatically, because it reminds him of his mother Sora. But often neglected is that Zoro also has a bit of character development here. Zoro has a rather emotional moment where he finds a broken sword and lingers on it with a sorrowful gaze of times gone by. It's such a good Zoro-Sanji contrast. Sanji's moment sounding more like, "Oh, mother dearest, you were taken from this world far too early," whereas Zoro's is more like, "Oh, sword, your cutting days cut short by the compromised structural integrity resulting from the inevitable formation of iron oxide upon your exterior, and also your interior." I suppose it's all the same now. Both, and yet neither. Now float free to the great armory in the sky. But just in case it wasn't obvious enough, Oda gave the Sanji game away even earlier than this. In chapter 174, when Sanji adopts the alias of Mr. Prince, which is a fascinating use of the concept of an alias, the idea of concealing who you are by using your true identity. But that's the thing, right? There are so many instances in One Piece of characters telling the truth, often blatantly spoiling future plot points. But us as readers, and also characters in world, just not believing them at the time. For example, in chapter 820, Momonosuke outright stated that he had met the former pirate king Gol D. Roger. And mate, this was such a ballsy maneuver. The only person paying any real attention at the time is Usopp. Robin is distracted by Luffy and Nami, and Usopp's immediate reaction is of course to project and accuse Momonosuke of lying. Looking back on it, Kinemon and Nekomamushi say nothing, because they were still keeping their time travel secret, which really did not help Momo's case. But as it turns out, he was telling the truth. And stuff like this is the reason why these days, every word a character says is hyperanalyzed, because nobody wants to miss the next big time traveling plot twist. And at the time, no one had any idea, which we can see by looking back at old Reddit posts from this era. Why did Momonosuke say that he have met Roger? He around 8 and Gol D. Roger died 20 plus years ago. So what is Oda trying to pull? Either he lied to look cool, or he is older than he looks. I don't know which I would prefer, only that Oda will go with a third option, which was very correct actually, he was neither. either, and we did go with the third option. But this led to a lot of theories that were maybe sort of on the right track, but in the very wrong direction. One is that Jewelry Bonnie had made Momonosuke a child with her devil fruit abilities, although the prevailing thought at the time was that Momonosuke had actually met Ace and he was mistaking Ace for Roger. Ace was confirmed to have been in Wano and is the son of the Pirate King. It's probably the only thing that would make sense in terms of Momo meeting Roger without some time travel fuckery. But as it turns out, it was indeed the fuckery. And more of that would ensue when Kanjuro was eventually revealed to be the mysterious Kozuki traitor. But this one didn't take us quite as off guard as the time travel, because Oda was not subtle about Kanjuro. He was not subtle at all. From his introduction in chapter 754, we already knew that much like the cabbage he was holding, Kanjuro isn't quite what he seems. Too many people focus on the cabbage rather than the hand that was holding the cabbage. Kanjuro was holding the cabbage in his right hand, as well as every other object he would go on to arm himself with. However, whenever he made art, it was created exclusively with his left hand, as if handicapping himself, resulting in lovely creations such as the bird drawing. But even the bird gives the entire game away, because in chapter 920, we have a flashback of the vassals being sent forward in time, where we see two of Kanjuro's Dressrosa birds just flapping about in the background on their way to deliver messages to Orochi. The only difference is that these birds are drawn much more better, because as it turns out, when Kanjuro uses his right hand, his dominant hand, his images are the height of realism. So he was deliberately drawing terrible images to hinder the Kozuki clan. In addition to doing all sorts of weird stuff like covering Kinemon's eyes during Zoro, like what was that about is what I said at the time, and now I know what it's about. It's about shenaniganry. Or trying to convince Usopp that firing a drawing at Sugar probably wasn't going to work. And to be fair, at the time that did sound like a reasonable criticism. But on Dressrosa, Kanjuro wanted Doflamingo to win, and he was really only putting in the bare minimum to not be called out as a traitor. At no point did Oda actually put in any effort to mask Kanjuro's intentions. It's just that we went along with it because it's One Piece and we're used to weird, wacky characters that hinder themselves. So Kanjuro was so suspicious that we could not possibly suspect him. But did you know that Oda blatantly dropped a colossal spoiler as early as chapter 13? Because these days we know that Luffy has the voice of all things. In chapter 821, he could hear Zunisha. In 684, the Sea Kings confirmed that Luffy had heard them. But if we go all the way back, way back to chapter 13, Luffy has a conversation with a literal dog, because Luffy spoke with and understood Choo Choo. And it's never really been brought up because Luffy likely assumes that everyone can do it, which his crew does reinforce, as both Chopper and Jinbei can speak to sectors of the animal kingdom as well. But there it is, quite possibly the most important ability in the entire series, spelled out for us as early as chapter 13. And it really makes you wonder what else is currently hidden in plain sight. Back on Jaya, Luffy and Zoro very quickly picked up that Blackbeard wasn't alone. It's not just one guy, Luffy said. I think there's more than one, Zoro said, essentially saying the same thing, and potentially referring to the rest of Teach's crew on the island, but also potentially referring to the mystery of Teach's body itself. And going all the way back to where this video started in chapter 134, there's one more curious thing Luffy says about people who never sleep. He says it's because if they sleep, they'll die, which could very well be alluding to the ultimate fate of Blackbeard, to simply fall asleep and end his time on this planet. And for another potentially blatant spoiler, there's Logtown, the town of beginnings and endings. It's where we started our journey, and it's very possible that Logtown is where it's going to end. That theory is an incredibly wild ride, and it may very well spoil One Piece, all of which you can find in this video.